Hello economics students, in this video we are looking at our second aggregate demand tool, or our second aggregate demand policy, and that is of course monetary policy. And monetary policy is only going to impact aggregate demand, unlike budgetary policy, which we'll find out soon impacts both aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now, up until recently, I don't think anyone really cared about monetary policy, and they certainly didn't know who this smiling guy here was, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Phil Lowe, or Big Phil as I like to call him. And of course, monetary policy is managed by, or used by, or controlled by Phil Lowe here and his 400 highly trained economists. And their job is to change the level of, or change the interest rate in the economy based on the underlying economic conditions. And we'll get more into that in a further video. But let's just recall that interest rates can either be the reward for saving. So if you're a saver, it impacts your reward you get for saving, or the cost of borrowing. So if you're borrowing money, which is what's probably more contentious at the moment for households who have mortgages, if you're borrowing money, the interest rates will impact your cost of borrowing. So Phil Lowe, the Reserve Bank, and the 400 economists, their job is to decide, do we increase interest rates given what's going on in the economy? Do we decrease interest rates given what's going on in the economy? Or do we just keep them on hold for a little bit and just see what's going on? There are some other monetary policy tools that we'll get into, but that's broadly what monetary policy is about. So this dot point is asking us to understand the role of the RBA with respect to monetary policy, which is outlined in their charter. Let's get into it. The first thing I want to talk about is the independence of the RBA, because I heard on the radio the other day someone said, why can't Jim Chalmers or Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, or Dan Andrews, the Premier of Victoria, why can't they just get on the phone, give Phil Lowe at the RBA a call and tell him to stop raising interest rates because it's hurting borrowers and hurting households? And of course, the answer is they can't, because the RBA is independent of the government. It makes decisions independently based on what's going on in the economy, assessing all different economic conditions. So remember that Jim Chalmers and the government, they have their tool or their policy, which is budgetary policy, their policy instrument, and Phil Lowe over here, the RBA, has his policy, and the rest of the economists have their policy, which is monetary policy, basically interest rates. Okay, now they're independent of each other. Of course, they're going to look at what each other is doing, but they're independent. Now, the role of the Reserve Bank of Australia in the Australian economy, they have lots of roles actually. Our job is to just think about monetary policy, the role to do with monetary policy, but they do also maintain the stability of the financial system. So they're making sure that kind of like the plumbing of the financial system is clear so that money can flow around properly. They're the bank for the government. They're the bank for other commercial banks. They clear payments, and they're also in charge of issuing currency, so notes and coins, and retrieving old notes, all that sort of fun stuff. But again, our job is to look at monetary policy. Now, the role of the RBA with respect to monetary policy was all set out in this thing called the Reserve Bank Act of 1959. It's actually what gives the RBA all its powers. It was an act of parliament, which means it was done by the government, and it gives the RBA its powers. Now, part of this act is something called a charter, which you will see in the study design. You can, as a VCE student, just think of these two things as exactly the same thing, the Charter or the Reserve Bank Act. Now, when this was written and when the government gave the RBA its powers, it said, hey, if you're going to be in charge of monetary policy, you need to do three things for us. Number one, you need to give us the stability of the currency. Now, you would be forgiven for thinking that the stability of the currency would be about the AUD, right? Because it says currency. Unfortunately not. Bear in mind that this was written in 1959. The stability of the currency is to do with inflation. And basically what happened in 1990 is the Reserve Bank changed sort of what how they interpreted this goal, and they basically decided that this was all about achieving 2 to 3% inflation. All right. Now, of course, this is our low and stable inflation goal from macroeconomics. You'll see that this is bolded a little bit here because although they don't say this, this is the primary goal of not just the RBA, but central banks around the world. So first and foremost, it's about inflation. The second goal of the RBA is to achieve full employment. We know what that means. And the third goal of the RBA is to achieve the economic prosperity and welfare of the people in Australia. Now, the RBA has basically alluded to the fact that this just means having strong growth that is also sustainable. And so you guessed it, it's our strong and sustainable economic growth target from macroeconomics, or goal, I should say. So the Reserve Bank has three things that it needs to do, which was set out in the Act. They call this a triple mandate, which means they have three things that needs to be achieved. Other central banks just have one, or sometimes two. So I could have not shown you this slide, and I could have just said the role of the RBA is the three macroeconomic goals, but I think it helps to kind of give a bit of context. All right, bye for now.